December 16th, 1985. Spark Steakhouse, Manhattan. Paul Castellano steps out as Lincoln. 3 men in trench coats. 6 gunshots. The most powerful mob boss in America drops dead on the sidewalk. Who had the guts to pull this off in broad view in New York City? John Gotti. This is the story of the man who broke every rule, killed his own boss, and became untouchable. Until he wasn't. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born in the Bronx on October 27, 1940. 5th of 13 children. His father worked sporadically as a day laborer, barely keeping the family fed. By the time John turned 12, the Gottis had settled in East New York, Brooklyn, one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. Poverty surrounded them. Violence was the language of the streets. And John Gotti learned to speak it fluently. He started running with street gangs at 12 years old, doing errands for local wise guys. At 14, he tried stealing a cement mixer from a construction site. The mixer fell, crushed his toes, left him with a permanent limp and a nickname among the neighborhood kids. Crazy Horse. He dropped out of high school at 16. There was no future in school anyway, not for a kid like him. The real money, the real respect, came from the Gambino crime family. Gotti's break came through Carmine Fatico, a soldier in the Gambino family, who ran operations out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. Gotti started with truck hijackings at Idlewild Airport, later renamed JFK. He was good at it, fearless, and he caught the attention of someone far more important. Aniello Delacroce, the Gambino family's underboss. Delacroce was old school, ruthless, a killer who commanded respect. And he saw something in Gotti, a younger version of himself. Delacroce became his mentor, his protector, and the only reason Gotti would survive what came next. In 1973, Emmanuel Gambino, nephew of boss Carlo Gambino, was kidnapped and murdered by an Irish gangster named James McBratney. Carlo wanted revenge. He assigned Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallione to find McBratney and bring him in. They found him at a bar on Staten Island. But the hit went sideways. When they tried to pose as cops and arrest him, McBratney fought back. Gallione panicked and shot him dead. Witnesses saw everything. Gotti was arrested in June 1974. This should have been the end of his career. Instead, it was the beginning of his rise. With help from attorney Roy Cohn, Gotti cut a deal, attempted manslaughter, for years in prison. He did his time quietly, and when he walked out in 1977, he was a made man. Carlo Gambino had died the year before, and the new boss, Paul Castellano, had opened the family's membership books. Gotti was inducted and immediately promoted to captain of the Bergen crew, the same crew he'd worked under before prison. And here's what most people didn't know. Castellano didn't want Gotti in the family. He thought Gotti was reckless, too violent, too flashy. But Delacroce insisted. He told Castellano that Gotti's crew would report directly to him, not to boss. Castellano agreed, but only to keep the peace. Delacroce was too powerful to ignore. This arrangement created a split in the Gambino family. Castellano controlled the white-collar rackets, the construction unions, the legitimate businesses. Delacroce controlled the streets, gambling, loan sharking, hijacking. And Gotti thrived under Delacroce's protection, becoming one of the family's biggest earners. But there was one rule Castellano enforced without exception: no drugs. Anyone caught dealing heroin would be killed. No questions asked. If you think this is brutal, subscribe. Gotti's reign gets way more insane. By the early 1980s, Gotti was living large. Custom suits, a crew of loyal soldiers, money rolling in from every racket in Queens. He even had a hand in the Lufthansa heist at Kennedy Airport in December 1978, the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. $6 million stolen. Gotti arranged for the getaway van to be crushed at a scrapyard, covering the crew's tracks. But while Gotti's star was rising, his relationship with Castellano was falling apart. Castellano was everything Gotti despised. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island that looked like the White House. He rarely met with soldiers, preferring to run the family like a corporation from a distance. He had no street credibility. And worst of all, Castellano was cutting into Gotti's profits, demanding a bigger share of the Bergen crew's hijacking operations. Gotti felt disrespected, insulted, and he wasn't the only one. Then in August 1983, disaster struck. Angelo Ruggiero and Gotti's brother Gene were arrested for heroin trafficking. The charges were based on FBI recordings from a bug planted in Ruggiero's house. Castellano was furious. He demanded the tapes to see if his own name had been mentioned. Ruggiero refused to hand them over. Castellano threatened to demote Gotti and kill anyone involved in the drug trade. Gotti knew what that meant. He was next on the list. But Castellano had bigger problems. In 1984, he was indicted on racketeering charges for his involvement with Roy DeMeo's crew, a group of contract killers responsible for dozens of murders. Then in 1985, he was hit with a second indictment for his role on the Commission, the Mafia's governing body. Facing life in prison, Castellano appointed acting bosses to run the family while he fought his cases. One of those acting bosses was Thomas Bellotti, Castellano's driver and most trusted confidant. Bellotti hated Gotti as much as Castellano did. Gotti saw his window closing. If Castellano beat the charges, Gotti was dead. If Castellano went to prison, he'd order the hit from behind bars. Gotti had one option: kill Castellano first. But there was a problem. Mafia rules said a boss could only be killed with approval from the Commission. The other four families had to sign off on it. And Castellano had deep ties with the Genovese family, especially their boss, Vincent the Chin Gigante. If Gotti asked for permission, Gigante would tip off Castellano. So Gotti did something almost unheard of. He began planning an unsanctioned hit, the first assassination of a sitting boss in 5 years. He recruited a crew of loyalists: Sammy the Bull Gravano, Frank DeCicco, and several other captains who resented Castellano's leadership. They had money, muscle, and motive, but they needed one more thing: an opportunity. And on December 2nd, 1985, that opportunity arrived. Aniello Delacroce died of cancer. Gotti's protector, the only man standing between him and Castellano, was gone. Castellano didn't even attend Delacroce's wake. It was the ultimate sign of disrespect, and it told Gotti everything he needed to know. Castellano was planning to restructure the family, break up Gotti's crew, and eliminate the threat once and for all. Gotti had days, maybe weeks, before Castellano made his move. Then Frank DeCicco delivered the perfect setup. Castellano had scheduled a meeting at Spark Steakhouse on East 46th Street for December 16th at 5 p.m. He'd be there with Bellotti and several other mobsters. Gotti assembled a hit squad. For shooters dressed in identical trench coats and Russian fur hats, armed with semi-automatic pistols. Gotti and Gravano would watch from a car parked nearby. The plan was simple: wait for Castellano and Bellotti to arrive, execute them both, disappear into the evening rush hour. December 16th, 1985, 5:17 p.m. Castellano's Lincoln pulls up to Spark Steakhouse. Bellotti steps out first, walking around the car to open the door for his boss. The shooters move in. 6 shots to Castellano's head. He drops instantly. Bellotti tries to reach for his gun. 3 more shots. He falls beside his boss. The shooters scatter into the crowd. The entire hit takes less than 30 seconds. Gotti and Gravano drive slowly past the scene. Gotti rolls down his window, stares at the bodies, and nods. It's done. The most powerful mob boss in America is dead, and John Gotti just became the most wanted man in New York. Here's what makes this even crazier. The FBI had been surveilling Castellano for months. They had cameras, wiretaps, agents following his every move. But they had no idea Gotti was planning to kill him. They didn't see it coming. And now the FBI had a new target. Several days after the murder, Gotti was named to a temporary 3-man committee to run the Gambino family, while an internal investigation into Castellano's death took place. But everyone knew it was a charade. Gotti had orchestrated the hit, and every captain in the family knew it. On January 15, 1986, at a meeting of 20 captains, John Gotti was formally elected boss of the Gambino crime family. He was 45 years old, and he was about to become the most famous mobster in America. Gotti didn't just run the family. He became a celebrity. He wore $1,500 Armani suits, got his hair styled twice a week, smiled and waved at news cameras outside the courthouse. The media ate it up. They called him the Dapper Don. He set up his headquarters at the Rave Night Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, where he held court like a king. The Gambino family, already the most powerful crime organization in the country, was bringing in $500 million a year. Gotti himself was making somewhere between $5 and $12 million annually. He banned plea bargains. He refused to let anyone in the family admit the organization even existed, and for a while, it looked like nothing could touch him. In March 1986, Gotti went to trial for assault and racketeering. The prosecution had witnesses, recordings, a mountain of evidence. But when the trial began, witnesses suddenly couldn't remember what happened. Jury members looked nervous. And on March 13, 1987, Gotti was acquitted of all charges. The press went wild. The New York Post ran the headline, "I for Gotti." It later came out that a juror had been paid $60,000 to vote not guilty. But by then it was too late. Gotti was untouchable. And the media gave him a new nickname, the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck to him. In January 1989, Gotti was arrested again, this time for ordering the assault of a union official named John O'Connor. As a police car pulled away from the rave night, Gotti smirked and said, 3-1 I beat this charge. And on February 9, 1990, he did exactly that, acquitted again. Fireworks lit up the streets of Queens that night. Locals celebrated like their team had won the Super Bowl. The FBI was humiliated. Jules Bonavolanta, director of the FBI's Organized Crime Division, held a press conference and said, "What the public should realize is that he is the boss of the largest Cosa Nostra family, that he surrounds himself with ruthless killers, and that he is flat out a criminal." But the FBI wasn't giving up. They just needed a different strategy. Before I reveal how they finally caught him, drop a comment. How would you take down the Teflon Don? By 1989, the FBI had a problem. Gotti was smart. He knew the rave night was bugged. So he never talked business inside the club. Instead, he'd take walk talks, strolling the streets of Little Italy while discussing murders and racketeering. The FBI couldn't record him, couldn't build a case. And Gotti knew it. He was untouchable. Or so he thought. In November 1989, the FBI made a breakthrough. They discovered that Gotti wasn't just holding meetings on the street. He was using an apartment above the rave night, owned by the widow of a Gambino soldier. It was a safe space where Gotti could speak freely. So the FBI planted bugs. And they hit gold. In a conversation recorded on December 12, 1989, Gotti openly acknowledged ordering the murders of Robert DiBernardo and Liborio Melito. He talked about killing Louis Di Bono, a soldier who'd been skimming money. And most damaging of all, he complained about his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gotti blamed Gravano for the family's problems, called him greedy, and implied he was too ambitious. These tapes were a prosecutor's dream, but they were also a ticking time bomb, because Sammy Gravano heard them, and he didn't like what he heard. Sammy, the Bull Gravano, was Gotti's right-hand man. He'd helped plan the Castellano hit. He'd murdered 19 people for the family. He was loyal, feared, and respected. But when he listened to those recordings, something shifted. Gotti wasn't just criticizing him. Gotti was setting him up, framing him as a mastermind behind murders they'd both committed. If Gotti went down, he was taking Gravano with him. On December 11, 1990, the FBI raided the rave night. They arrested Gotti, Gravano, and Frank Locascio, the family's consigliere. Federal prosecutors charged them with 5 murders, including Castellano and Bellotti, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, illegal gambling, and tax evasion. This time, there would be no bail, no jury tampering. The FBI had Gotti in custody, and they weren't letting go. But they still needed one more thing to guarantee a conviction. They needed someone from inside the family to testify. Someone who knew where the bodies were buried. Someone like Sammy Gravano. And on November 13, 1991, that's exactly what happened. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino crime family, flipped. He agreed to become a government witness. It was the first time a New York underboss had ever turned informant, and it was a death sentence for John Gotti. The trial began in January 1992. For the first time, the jury was fully anonymous and sequestered. They couldn't be bribed, threatened, or intimidated. Prosecutors played hours of recordings showing Gotti discussing murders and racketeering. They called witnesses who identified members of Gotti's crew at the Castellano hit. And then on March 2nd, they brought Sammy Gravano to the stand. Gravano confirmed everything. He described the Gambino family's structure. He walked the jury through the conspiracy to kill Castellano, step by step. He admitted to 19 murders and implicated Gotti in 4 of them. Gotti's defense attorney tried to break him during cross-examination, attacking his credibility, calling him a liar and a junkie. But Gravano didn't crack. He sat there calmly and told the truth. Every single word. The defense had nothing. They called one witness, Gotti's tax attorney, who testified that Gotti had filed his taxes properly. It was laughable. Gotti himself became increasingly hostile during the trial, shouting at the judge, calling Gravano a rat, trying to disrupt the proceedings. At one point, Judge Leo Glasser threatened to remove him from the courtroom entirely. On April 2nd, 1992, after only 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Gotti guilty on all charges. James Fox, assistant director of the FBI's New York field office, stepped up to the microphones and said, "The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered with Velcro and all the charges stuck." On June 23rd, 1992, Judge Glasser sentenced John Gotti to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also fined $250,000. It was over. The Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the most powerful mob boss in America, was finished. Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure prisons in the country. He spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, allowed out for only 1 hour of recreation. He filed appeals, but every single one was rejected. In 1998, he was diagnosed with throat cancer and transferred to a medical facility in Springfield, Missouri for surgery. The tumor was removed, but the cancer came back 2 years later. His condition deteriorated rapidly. On June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, John Gotti died. The Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn refused to allow a requiem mass for his funeral. When his body was carried to the cemetery, an estimated 300 people followed the procession, which passed by the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, where Gotti had started his criminal career decades earlier. He was buried next to his son, Frank, who'd been killed in a tragic accident in 1980. Gotti's brother, Peter, who'd taken over as acting boss of the family, couldn't attend. He was in prison. And here's the final insult. The other 4 New York crime families sent no representatives to the funeral. No flowers. No condolences. Nothing. It was their way of saying John Gotti hadn't just destroyed himself. He destroyed the Gambino family, too. By the time he died, half of the family's made men were either dead or in prison. The organization never fully recovered. As for Sammy Gravano, he entered witness protection and was relocated with his family. But in 2000, he was arrested again, this time for running an ecstasy trafficking ring in Arizona. He was sentenced to 20 years. He served 17 and was released in 2017. Gotti's legacy is complicated. To some, he was a folk hero, a working-class kid from the Bronx who rose to the top of the underworld. To others, he was a ruthless killer who murdered his way to power and destroyed everyone around him. Anthony Gaspite Casso, former underboss of the Lucchese crime family, once said, "What John Gotti did was the beginning of the end of Cosa Nostra." But here's the question nobody can answer. How many people did John Gotti really kill? He was convicted of 5 murders. The FBI estimates he ordered at least 40. And then there's the money. Gotti made millions. Where did it go? His family claims they have nothing. The feds never recovered it. Somebody knows. But they're not talking. And here's the other mystery. Who really ran the Gambino family after Gotti went to prison? His son, John Jr., took over for a while, but he eventually flipped too, claiming he left the life. His brother Peter stepped in, but he was arrested and died in prison in 2021. So who's in charge now? The family still exists. It's weaker, smaller, but it's still out there, operating in the shadows, just like it always has. So what do you think? Was Gotti a criminal genius, or just got lucky for years? And did Gravano do the right thing by testifying, or was he just saving his own skin? Drop your theory below. Subscribe for next week's shocking mob case. John Gotti wanted to be famous. He wore the best suits, smiled for the cameras, lived like a celebrity. And that's exactly what killed him, because the FBI couldn't let the Teflon Don make a mockery of the justice system. They couldn't let him walk free while the whole world watched. His arrogance, his need for attention, his belief that he was untouchable, that was his downfall. He forgot the first rule of organized crime: stay in the shadows. And when he stepped into the light, it burned him alive. Next week, the mobster who became an FBI informant and disappeared with $200 million and was never seen again.